Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the Don't Risk It podcast. I'm your host, Chris Rogers with VFIS Client Risk Solutions, and we're taking a bit of a break during the holidays to recharge the batteries for 2024. We hope that you enjoy these encore presentations of some of our favorite past episodes. With the holiday season upon us and related seasonal events, we felt it'd be a good time to revisit non-members riding in department vehicles. Please be on the lookout for new episodes coming in January with special guests and new topics. With that being said, here's my discussion with members of the Client Risk Solutions team discussing some best practices regarding this topic. I want to welcome Dave Bradley, Mike Baker, and Brian DeQuinn to the program. They're all members of the Client Risk Solutions team, and they're here to discuss some things to consider when allowing non-members to ride in your department's vehicles. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining me today, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
So when we're talking about non-members riding in an ESO's vehicle, are we talking about parades, community events, or a citizen ride-along program, or something else?
Chris, I'll start that off. So it's really all of those. So we're talking about Santa Claus riding in the hose bed during the holidays. We're talking about, the sports team being in the open trailer, being towed behind the squad vehicle, the elected officials being in the duty vehicle with the chief officers. All of those are really relevant to kind of the things that we're going to talk about here in this podcast today.
So what are some of the reasons that an organization might consider doing this? Are there positive takeaways or goodwill that an organization can gain by permitting these activities?
Absolutely, Chris. And, when you look at these activities, especially the ride-alongs where you're educating people on what your system does, and, whether it be the press, whether it be an elected official, it really lets them see the inside workings of how your organization works and what you do for the community.
So really what we're trying to be concerned about here is the members who have non-members riding along with them. So it's really comes down to the general community that's riding in their vehicle and the exposure that you have, because vehicle response is already inherently dangerous in emergency services. But then you add to the fact that you're putting those folks in that danger with you. And it's really something that we're trying to limit or avoid those situations.
Well, Mike, to kind of expand upon that is, when we allow those people into the vehicle, it oftentimes becomes a distraction. So we're going to try to entertain them. We're going to try to have conversations about what the call is that we might be going to, what the situation looks like. And all of those things are now taking our focus off of the main task at hand, which is safe vehicle operations that we really encourage.
And from an insurance perspective, what we end up having is a liability not only for the other vehicles that we may be involved in an accident with, but we also now have the passenger that's in our own vehicle. And that's a liability you got to be careful and mindful of.
So to kind of echo on that risk and liability piece that you just mentioned, there's a potential for risk in almost anything that we do. But with that being said, what are some risk reduction considerations our department should take into account relating to these community type events or ride-along programs?
One of the things when we see these fundraisers or community, PR events, I'll call them, where we're hauling the Little League team in the vehicle after they won the championship, or we always go back to Santa Claus. I mean, the Santa Claus taking them around the community. What we really want to do is make sure that whatever we're doing is designed for that vehicle's use. So those folks who are riding with us, first off, need to be in a seated position, designed seated position on that vehicle that has a properly, addressed seat belt that is actually being utilized by that person. You can't allow people to ride on the tailboards, on top of the aerial device, in the bucket, on the platform. They've got to be in a seated position on that vehicle. That is huge, and we see so many incidents where people fall from the vehicle during one of these events, and the outcome is generally not favorable for the department or the individual.
Mike, and to kind of piggyback off that is really, you're seeing it more and more where fire departments are using their open trailers to have the sports teams or the bands, and they're pulling those behind events. Even recently seeing Santa Claus on a boat being pulled by a vehicle. Again, all high probabilities of something happening and a potential for a bad event.
The other side, too, is when you have those folks in your vehicles, our vehicles aren't a normal passenger vehicle. They're high. It's tough for some folks to get in and out of those vehicles. So really what you want to do is even take it a step further and assist them with both getting in and out of those vehicles, so nobody slips and falls on, wet diamond plate or a heightened thing where they can't reach and have 3 points of contact. Those are things that you really got to be concerned about. So you really have to be careful with even getting in and off of the vehicles as well.
My next question probably was just answered a little bit in y'all's last answers, but I'll ask it anyway because it focuses on the emergency side. Ride-alongs aren't exclusive to community types of events. Some departments will allow individuals to go on ride-alongs during emergency calls. There's a fire department in the town that I live in that they have a citizens fire department where you can, or citizens fire academy where you can go do ride-alongs on emergency calls. So what are some considerations our department should take into account when allowing non-members to go on an emergency type event versus community type events?
One of the things to consider is, and we have a resource that's available out there, is a waiver. So anytime you have somebody who's not a member or an employee of your organization who wants to ride with you on those incidents or those responses, certainly have them sign a waiver, and that will help alleviate some of the concerns with regard to the liability.
Something else to think about is, does that vehicle need to be operating in emergency mode? We kind of talked about it, pre-recording here, but that might be something to think about within your organization as well. Is does that person then go non-emergently to those calls to minimize that exposure, minimize that risk, and potentially avoid some type of a catastrophic event because of that distraction that's ultimately occurring?
Mike, you brought up waivers in your last point. Is that something that should be considered on the community service side as well, or do you think that's strictly an emergency service type?
I think you would be beneficial for an organization to consider it in both of those situations. Anytime you have somebody who's not a member, an active member of your organization or an employee of your organization, it's a good idea to acknowledge that with use of a waiver, just letting them know of the risks that are involved with this, as well as acknowledging the potential for injury that could occur.
Mike, to kind of piggyback off that, something else to consider is we're seeing it more and more in some of these small rural departments. They get the younger members that want to go somewhere busier. So they go do weekends at busy fire departments and may not become a member of that organization, but simply just riding along. I think if we're having that occur within our organization, there needs to be a letter from the chief officer of the home organization of that member that acknowledges them being there. That, again, just open line of communication that we have in addition to that waiver.
To piggyback on having an established waiver in place, think about the organizations that have a contract or should have a contract with an EMS training agency, whether it's EMT, AEMT, paramedic, where a non-member is riding on that ambulance for clinical experience. That agency and the training facility should have an agreement signed by both.
So, Brian, to kind of echo what you mentioned or piggyback off that, is it a good idea to formalize these activities or procedures into an SOG or SOP? And if so, does VFIS have something that can help our listeners get started?
Absolutely. We've talked about it many different times in podcast recordings. SOPs, SOGs are really the gameplay for your organization. So a lot of these things should absolutely be documented and readily available for the membership. This included would be one of them. You can certainly find those resources on VFIS.com. There's actually a sample waiver there as well. Or you can go into responderhelp.com and find some sample SOPs, SOGs for your organization to at least get you started with best practice.
And one last area that kind of goes a little bit out of the liability of someone physically riding your vehicle, but are there privacy concerns that we should consider when allowing non-members to ride in our vehicles?
Yeah, most certainly. If they're dealing with any type of patient contact, those are things that need to be kept confidential. And that's, again, all the things that can be included into your SOP, SOG, that can be included in that waiver, that the things that they see during that incident, that ride along, are confidential information. So all of those things can be captured. And again, you can go to VFIS.com to get some of those resources, get the sample of that waiver, or you can go to responderhelp.com and look at those SOP, SOG samples to at least get you started in a good direction.
And we'll also include a copy of that of our sample policy in the description of this program. And gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining me today. It was a pleasure to chat with you all as always. And again, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
And I want to thank you for listening to the program today and for your interest in VFIS safety resources. I want to thank our guests Dave Bradley, Mike Baker, and Brian DeQuinn once again for their time and information. Please consider subscribing to our program to stay up to date on new content releases. Also, if you like what you've heard, please consider leaving a review below. For more information about the many resources available from VFIS, please visit VFIS.com. And to submit ideas for future discussions, please reach out by email at VFISriskcontrol@VFIS.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Gladfelter Insurance Group, VFIS, and its employees.